Hey, welcome to Cheaper Jeeper TV, the show that helps you get the most for your money so that you get the most for your Jeep. In this week's episode, we're going to replace the rotors and brake pads of a 2018 Jeep Wrangler Sahara JL, so stick around. Okay, now I do have a video on how to remove the tires if you're going to do a tire rotation. And I also have a video on how to service the brakes, and that is to lube the pins and that kind of thing. And I also go on and explain the mechanical workings of brakes. The links to those videos will be in the description below this one if you want to consult those for more information. Okay, essentially, if you're replacing the rotors and the brake pads of your vehicle, here at Jeep Wrangler JL Sahara 2018, it's a matter of removing the caliper and then taking out the worn brake pads and replacing them with new ones, and taking the rotor off and replacing it with a new one, or if this one's still in good condition and still has enough thickness on it, you can have these machined for about $20–25 each, and you could reuse these if you wanted to save some money. So let's get started with disassembling this so we can install our new components. To remove the caliper, which is this part here, which holds the pads onto the rotor, I need to remove this by removing two bolts that hold this adapter on. Let's try and have a look. There are these two 18mm bolts holding the caliper bracket on, and I'm using a shallow 18mm socket to loosen them and take them out. Now it's on pretty tight, so there is a little technique that you could use, and I'll show you. To get some leverage on that ratchet, just use a wrench and put the box head over the handle. That gives you extra leverage to loosen it. There you go. Let's loosen the next one. The location of this bolt allows you to use the breaker bar. This is a good time to remove the caliper pin bolts because it's easier when the caliper is still attached. Use a 13mm socket. That allows us to remove the caliper, and we'll rest it on the bucket. And now we can remove the two 18mm caliper adapter bolts. That allows us to remove the brake pads, and close inspection reveals that it was about time, as the pad level was very close to the wear indicator. And here we have a look at the caliper adapter, and we will remove the pins and the sliding clips and clean all that area up and put in some freshly cleaned and new components. And here's the part number for the rear brakes and slide clips, and I'll explain how you could save 20% in the tip segment. So you can see as you open the box, there are two sets of rear brakes. And then in the bag, you've got your set of sliding clips. And here is the caliper adapter. And what I wanted to do so as to make sure I didn't get confused is I arranged the clips around the adapter in the right orientation, because they have a particular shape with these little springs that are to be on the outer sides. So I felt this technique helped me make sure I matched up the right clips on the caliper adapter. Now it's time to take some brake clean and a wire brush and clean up the caliper adapter. It wasn't too bad really, and I just wanted to make sure that I did a good job cleaning the parts of the adapter where the sliding clips attach. And you can see here I did a pretty good job of cleaning it up. It looks nice and shiny in there, and those clips ought to fit in quite nicely. arrangement of the pads. You got the pins on the bottom, and they'll go into the bracket with the bracket oriented like this. And so what we want to do is put grease on top of there. And one way to do it is to put it on these ears of the pads, and then when you slip it in, they'll get in there. Or you could do it both ways. Permatex Ceramic Extreme Brake Lubricant. So the piston will touch against this pad, that's why this pad's here. See how they spring? Very nice. This you have to peel, which is interesting. Put it just in behind those little curls. They spring. Nice. Okay, now we got to clean these babies. Cleaning of the caliper pins and boots was covered in detail in the basic Jeep brake service video, the link to which will be in the description section of this video. I'll just go through the process quickly here. Essentially, I just clean up the pins and re-grease them with the silicone grease. I clean out the boots and re-grease the inside of those, and then I install the cleaned and greased pins back into the caliper adapter. So I've got the new pads, the new brackets here, new grease between the pads and the brackets, and then the pins are cleaned and spongy, so we're ready to put it back on. Before we install our new brake pads, we first have to remove the old rotor. It's important to realize that each rotor is held in place with a screw that requires a hex 27 bit. And these bits inevitably seize up, so make sure before you start the job you go around the Jeep and spray each of those screws with some penetrating lubricant. Although a hex 27 is called for, I found mine a bit loose, so I used a hex 30 and I tapped it in, and I would tap it in with a successive series of taps to loosen the rust, to make sure I can get those screws out without stripping. Should you strip the head of that screw, you're going to need to drill it out. So I advise extreme caution here, because it's a real pain in the neck should you seize that screw. I'll put a link to a tool called a hammer operated impact driver, which I think mechanics would use in scenarios like this. Now let's get back to the job and remove the rear rotor so we can install the new one. Yep, stuck. You can kind of count on that. So now you can see the caliper is removed. You can see where the bolts went in to hold the caliper adapter in place. But there's this little rubber grommet area right here. We're going to unplug that, and there's a little wheel that we're going to spin with a screwdriver to back off the emergency brake to give us a little bit of an easier time to get this rotor off. So once you have the cover off, you put a screwdriver into the hole, and by feel try to determine where the sprocket is, and then spin it to back the emergency brake off of the drum should you believe that that is why the rotor won't come off. This is an inside view of the sprocket of the emergency brake on the passenger side, which can be accessed near the bottom of the hole. However, when you do the driver's side rear tire, you'll notice, as you can see here, that the sprocket is located near the top. But even if your emergency brakes aren't hanging onto your rotor, it still may be tough to get off due to corrosion, at which point some heavy hitting with a hammer will come into play. So now, with the rotor off, you want to clean any rust that you see on this surface here. This isn't very bad at all, but I'm going to clean it up. And then, probably from going off-road, there seems to be a lot of rust inside the emergency brake area. You can see on the spring, and it's collected here on the pads. So I'm going to clean it all with some brake cleaner. And I'll just use a wire brush to clean it up. This is just like a bit of a coating on it. It isn't really a lot of rust, thankfully. But we have a solution for that, so that the next time that we have to do this, it's going to be a lot easier, because I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on here, and I'll show you in a second. Probably a lot of dirt got in here from going through mud and dirty water when off-roading. So this is a good time to clean it all up. They do have these little rotary kind of discs that you could put on an electric drill to help clean up this area, but I didn't expect it would be too bad, and a wire brush will do, but you could use that tool if you wanted. I've learned that copper anti-seize is a good product to put onto the hub, which will keep it from corroding and will make removing the rotor on the next brake job a lot easier. I'm going to put some crown on some of these parts that are rusting. It's time to install the rear rotor, and here's the part number, and I'll explain in the tip segment how I got it for 20% off. The rotors are shipped with a light coating of oil to keep them from rusting while in storage. Before you install them, make sure you spray them with brake clean and then wipe them down to remove the oil. Once you've installed the new and cleaned rotor, you can secure it with that hex 27 screw that you didn't strip earlier. And throughout the project, if you get any oil on any brake components, clean it off immediately with the brake clean. That's good. So now we've got the rotor on, and let's now go play with the caliper. The issue that we're faced with here now is for this caliper to fit over the brake pads, we have to push this piston in. And I'm going to show you how to do it with a clamp, but there's also something we need to take care of in the engine bay at the master cylinder where the brake fluid is. This is what's called the master cylinder. It's where the brake fluid goes in, right here. Now I have actually bled the brakes a while back, and so my fluid level is at the proper level, even though the brake pads have worn down a bit. Because basically when the brake pads wear down and the cylinder is pushed out more, this fluid level would drop. But since I've bled it recently, the fluid level is near the top. So when I compress that brake cylinder so I can get everything to fit back together with those nice new thick pads, this fluid level will rise. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. So let's go and start compressing that cylinder, and we'll keep an eye on this. So there is a specific tool that's designed to help compress the piston here of the caliper, but you can also use just a clamp if you happen to have one at home. And just take one of the old brake pads to put it here, and then take your clamp, and then you could just begin to tighten this, and it'll begin to compress the piston of the caliper. Okay, we'll continue to compress the caliper piston. And I just went and checked the master cylinder, and we're nowhere near the top of it, so we're okay right now. So now I can take this off. So the first thing we need to do is get the caliper adapter and slide it on. Now some people recommended putting some anti-seize on these caliper bolts, and then other people suggested some Loctite. From the people I talked to, I think I'm going to go along with the idea of using anti-seize. Just put a light coating on. And then when I torque it back on, I'm going to use a paint pen to mark its location, and I'll keep an eye on it to see if it's going to be a problem or not. So we have these two holes that we match up to the back side. Then take our 18mm bolts. So now we've got the caliper adapter bolts holding the caliper adapter with the brake pads. The caliper is right there, and now we got to torque it to 74 foot-pounds. There's one. Just get it past there a little bit. Okay, get that out of there now. That's the sway bar link that's kind of in the way, but we got it around it using a shallow socket. So this is now torqued on to the proper specs. We cleaned the pins, we cleaned the adapter bracket where these new brackets were installed. Then we lubed it for the new brakes, and we've already compressed the caliper, so now we just have to attach it. Now these pads, I've been told, have these pads here on the outside that are supposed to keep the noise down, so you don't need to put grease there. So I'll try it, and if I do find that there's noise, then I can go back and put the grease, but apparently that's what they're for. Okay? Alright, let's close that in. I'll put the caliper pin bolts in. These are 13mm bolts. It's at 27 foot-pounds of torque. I'm going to use this paint pen. Because I used anti-seize on the caliper adapter bolts, I want to make sure that they stay in place, so by marking them I could check them every once in a while.
In this image, I see this is a good time to give the reminder to put the rubber grommet back on the back of the emergency brake sprocket port. Well, that's actually quite interesting. We've just changed the brakes on the rear passenger side wheel. Doing the rear driver's side wheel is the same process, it's just the other side. So let's move on to the front brakes, and we'll do the brakes on the front passenger side. Now let's do the front passenger side brakes. Turning the wheel to the left gives you better access to the caliper adapter bolts behind the wheel. But we'll first remove the caliper pin bolts because it's easier to do that while the caliper is attached. And a 13mm socket is required.
This is the caliper adapter bolt, and that's the other one, and that holds this whole caliper adapter and these brake pads. Take the 18 mil socket with the breaker bar. Well, these are bigger at the front. It's 21 mil. So I broke that one. Now we'll break this one loose. So you can see that this caliper has two pistons at the front, which are pretty dirty, so I'll have to clean those up. And these pads are bigger than the rear ones. So this is how the caliper came off, and we'll clean this up and have a look at it. First we'll take out these brake pads. Okay, these are needing some servicing because they're kind of sticky. Let's get this cleaned up a little bit. So that's where the brackets are going to go now. That's all cleaned up. This part as well. Next thing, we gotta clean these things.
Once again, the details in cleaning the caliper pins is covered in the basic Jeep brake service video, the link to which is found in the description section of this video. And here's the part number for the front brakes, so let's have a look at them. I tried to make sure that I was mindful of the orientation of the brake pads as they came out of the caliper bracket, as well as those slider clips. And I would match the orientation of the new ones to the old, and then I would just clip them in.
The next thing to do is put grease on them. Put grease on the pads. And like I heard earlier elsewhere, that because they have these pads on the brake pads here on the outside, you don't have to put grease to keep the noise down. So I'll just not apply grease this time, but if I find that I do detect some more noise than normal, I'll put grease on later. Went in nicely. That went in nicely. And they spring. Okay. So let's grease up these pins. Okay. These are still a little tight. I may end up replacing those pins later. I think the reason is I used the wrong grease on these pins before. I used a petroleum-based grease, not a silicone-based grease. And that's before I knew better. And it causes the rubber on these pins to swell up. And I think that's why they seem a little tight in there, so I may end up replacing them. But that's easy, I could do that during any service. Okay. So that's ready to go on now. So we took off the caliper adapter, cleaned it up, put on these new brackets here, greased them, cleaned on the underside, put on the new brake pads, greased the ears, and we cleaned these pins as well and greased them as well with silicone lube. And now we're ready to put this on the new rotor. Let's clean up the caliper. We want to clear up all that dirt because when we compress these pistons, we don't want that dirt to get in between the seams of the rubber piston that you see there. Okay, so that's not bad. Now to put the brake pads back in, we need to push these pistons back. We'll take one of the old pads. They actually look very good still. It's just the back ones for some reason that were bad. So I may end up keeping these around just in case of an emergency. Now we start compressing. Now there's two pistons here. So I'm going to go back and forth between them as I compress. Okay, looks like it's compressed pretty well. And the master cylinder is okay. So you can undo this. Okay, now let's take off this rotor. Taking off that screw that holds on the rotor, so we just have to take it off. On this side we don't have an emergency brake that would hold it on, so hopefully this comes off a little easier.
So just like at the rear passenger rotor, we'll use some brake clean and a wire brush to clean up the area before we install our new rotor.
So make sure you get rid of all the rust in here. Most cars are flat here, but actually on this Jeep, there's a ridge here and a ridge here. So you want to make sure there's no rust here and here all the way around so that when the rotor sits against that, it won't wobble. For people who have all flat hubs, you want to get all of it off. The little bit of surface rust in here actually is not going to be in contact with the rotor, but I'm going to clean it up as best as I can. Okay, now we're going to put on some anti-seize. So now let's go get the new rotor.
The front rotors are vented rotors, and here's the part number, and in the tip segment I'll talk to you about the price.
So there's the new rotor. And I just spray it with some brake clean to clean off the oil that they put on during shipping to keep it from rusting. Okay.
Secure the rotor to the hub with the screw from the old rotor, and should you have stripped that screw, you can always just use a lug nut to hold it in place.
There we go. I am going to put some of the copper anti-seize on these bolts, and then I'm going to mark them when I torque them down with a paint pen. So should they come loose or come out of adjustment, I'll know right away when I look at it. But by doing this, it's going to make it a little easier to take them out next time. Okay, so those are ready. Just going to turn this so you can see it better. Now on the back rotors, the caliper adapter is on top, and the bolt goes through the caliper adapter then into the knuckle here. But on the front, the caliper adapter goes in behind this piece here, so the bolt goes through this piece then into the caliper adapter. So it's good to know that. Now we can tighten it down. Okay, now I gotta torque these two bolts to some crazy number like 147 foot-pounds or something. Let me look it up. Okay, 148 foot-pounds. So let's get that set up here. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's able to do it. That's good.
Now, since I used anti-seize on the caliper adapter bolts, I made sure that I marked them with a paint pen so I can monitor if they loosen at all.
Alright, so now let's slide these in. They're springy, which is good. And now it's time to put the caliper over top. So I'll grab this. You can see the pistons are all pushed in right here. Cleaned up fairly well. I'm not going to put grease on this time because I was told these little rubber pads replace that need for the grease, but should it make noise later, I'll put grease. Push in these pins, push in the bottom one. Okay, that's sitting in there. Let's put those caliper pin bolts in.
A 13mm socket was used to torque down the caliper pin bolts to 27 foot-pounds. And that's what it took to do the front rotors and brakes on a Jeep Wrangler JL. So now we've learned how to do the back brakes and rotors and the front brakes and rotors.
And that's pretty much all there is to it. All I had to do was pay for the rotor and the brake pads. And I'm pretty happy with the original equipment brakes that came with the Sahara, because in 2018, the Jeep Wrangler Sahara and Rubicon came with the HD heavy duty brake kit. So we have bigger rotors and bigger pistons and bigger brake pads, and it makes for an excellent brake system. I'm pretty happy with it. So I didn't think I needed to go and upgrade into something else. I just got OEM brakes because I'm really happy with them. I got them at 20% off, and I'll talk about that in the tip segment. And also talk in the tip segment about how much money I saved in labor.
Now for some cheaper Jeeper tips. It was in the Cheaper Jeeper TV air filter replacement DIY video where I first talked about moparpart.com and moparpartscanada.ca websites. Those websites offer Mopar parts at discounted rates. Also, when you register with them, you'll get email notifications of other sales and promotions, which regularly occur on New Year's, so you may want to register in time for this year. And in that video I shared, if you know you're going to be replacing air filters, why not get them in advance when they're on sale? And it's in that same spirit that I did the same with brake parts. In fact, just this week, October 29th, 2021, the manufacturer suggested retail price for the front brake pads and rotors and rear brake pads and rotors was $864. However, they're currently on sale, all those parts, for $629. That is a savings of 27%. But check this out, the dealer will charge for parts and labor $2,300 plus tax Canadian. Your DIY cost was $629 plus tax Canadian. That means you saved $1,671 Canadian. That is a savings of around 73%. And that sure is a lot more money in your pocket so that you could buy more things for your Jeep.
Hey, that's it for this week's episode of Cheaper Jeeper TV. I hope that you found it helpful, and if you did, please remember to give the video a thumbs up, and we'll see you next week. Until then, be well, stay safe, take care.